Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the first RT Talk of the season. We are honored and privileged today to have amongst us Mr. G. Mahalingam. Mr. Mahalingam is currently working in the capacity of Executive Director at the Reserve Bank of India and looking after market operations, international department, that is RBI's engagements with IMF, BIS, BRICS, G20, SAARC Finance and Statistics. Mr. Mahalingam is a University of Madras graduate with bachelor's degree in statistics, mathematics and economics. He did his master's in statistics and operations research from IIT Kanpur. Later, he went on to complete his MBA in International Banking and Finance from Birmingham Business School, UK, under the Golden Jubilee Scholarship of RBI. Please join me in welcoming one of the most brilliant minds of the country in the field of banking and finance, Mr. Mahalingam.
Going to use any PowerPoint, I'll be just talking. Good morning to all of you. I'm extremely happy to be here talking to you. Professor Ram had called me some time back. I thought it is a good opportunity to interact with all of you. I had known Mr. Ram for a very long time, and we have interacted in the capacity of a faculty and a student some time back. So I thought that it is a good opportunity for me to interact with you people, getting your ideas, getting your observations, getting your criticisms of the RBI policies. Now, in RBI, in fact, before I start the formal talk, let me tell you, in RBI, we are used to criticism. We are used to criticism. We are surprised if we are not criticized. We raise the interest rates, we are criticized. We lower the interest rates, we are criticized. We intervene in the forex markets, we criticize. We don't intervene, we go to sleep, we are criticized. So we know that for all these actions, uniformly, there's going to be a criticism. But one good thing about the criticism is that when somebody asks me the question, whenever I go to a session like this, or session on industry, or session of bankers, or session of corporates, one section of the audience will ask me the question, why did RBI intervene in the forex market at 67.60? What is sanctimonious about this rate? Before I could answer the question, there's another guy who would say, you didn't intervene very aggressively at that level. You should have intervened much more aggressively at that level. My job is rendered pretty easier. I tell this guy, please get the answer from that guy. I tell that guy, you get the answer from this guy. And my job is solved. This is exactly what happens with every one of RBI's actions. You have two sides to RBI's action in every financial market that RBI intervenes or RBI does not intervene. You have a set of arguments to defend RBI's actions. You have a set of arguments to rip off RBI's actions. After all, the people who are sitting within RBI, they have access to macro data. They have access to some information which perhaps in the public domain, it's not available. So our actions are informed by that extra piece of information that we have access to, plus the judgmental call. And the judgmental call can be different from person to person, from time to time, depending upon the circumstances that are prevailing. So this is where I feel today, if RBI is actually becoming the butt of discussion in the financial markets, a good part of the criticism could be termed as justified. And the same breath, you can say a good part of the criticism cannot be justified also. That's how things work. So life becomes pretty interesting for us. We face much more brickbats than bouquets, but we are used to it. I am well protected. I am coming in a full-fledged jacket, so even if brickbats won't affect me to that extent, not a problem at all. The subject matter that I am going to discuss today is going to be very general. It's not going to concern any particular stream. It's not going to concern just finance. It has a lot more to do with what is happening in the global world today. What is happening in the overall financial markets today. I'm going to avoid jargon. I'm going to just decipher for you in RBI's way of looking at things, how things are developing across the world. What these things span out for India, for RBI, and what kind of actions RBI has initiated, and how the country is shaping, maybe for the next about 5 years. This is going to be the subject matter. I am going to be open to questions right even in the middle of the session. If you have questions, you are free to ask the question at any point of time. While Professor Ram says that I am allocated about 15-20 minutes for questions at the end, fine, no problem. But if you have some questions in between, you are most welcome to raise those questions. If you want to criticize any of the arguments that I am going to advance, you are most welcome to criticize. I may not be able to give an answer to those criticisms, but I will take in my stride those criticisms, and I can assure you those criticisms will be taken as a part of policy making tomorrow when I get back to RBI. I want to start with what has been happening in the global financial world in the last about approximately 8 to 9 years. And the starting point for us today conveniently is provided by the global financial crisis, 2008-9, the Lehman Brothers failing. That provides a very good starting point for us to look at the world from the entire perspective of the global financial crisis. If you had to go back a little backward, I think maybe the starting point could be the bombarding of the World Trade Center in New York by the terrorists, Al-Qaeda terrorists, which started an entire interest rate slide in the US. From a level of 6.5% interest rate in US, it took them just about 5 years to reach an interest rate of 0. And then they slowly took it up, thinking that the US economy is improving. Suddenly, they found that the subprime loans, about which you would have heard of, US bankers trying to give loans to borrowers who are not really worth even 1 penny of lending. And all these loans, not only the bankers gave these loans were on-sold to a lot of investment banks around the world, and then ultimately the loans started bombing, no repayment started coming, and the loans became non-performing loans. This is the start of the global financial crisis. And Lehman Brothers, which had done absolutely reckless kind of participation in this kind of a melee, was the first to fold up. There were others which were on the verge of fold up, AIG, but thankfully they were saved. But once the global financial crisis started, it actually engulfed the entire financial world, not just in the US. It spread across the US, went beyond the shores of US, went into Europe, touched Asia. It did touch the fringes of Indian financial markets also. Once this global financial crisis started, the most important consequence of this, as any of us would understand, is risk aversion. The risk aversion sets in, which means no banker would ever like to give any further loans at all. You can see what is happening in India today. The Reserve Bank of India has started the asset quality review exercise of the banks. And when we started applying all our norms very strictly, mind you, we have not put in any new norms at all. Whatever is the definition of a non-performing asset, whatever is the definition of the repayment period, whatever is the definition of the standard asset, the same thing we have started enforcing a little more strictly, and skeletons are tumbling out of the cupboards. You find that bank after bank today, particularly in the public sector, they are actually getting more and, a greater and greater part of the balance sheet is getting dented. The kind of losses that we have seen, that the public sector banks have disclosed in the last quarter, is a kind of an unprecedented number. Similar things started happening in US in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. Banks became risk averse. Once the banks became risk averse, which means they didn't want to give a loan, and the borrowers started disappearing because the industrial activity, the economic activity, the demand for the economic activity was going down in the economy, the central banks came into picture. The central banks came into picture. What do central banks do? Central banks actually raise the interest rates, lower the interest rates. They raise the interest rates when the GDP of a country is growing feverishly, that the inflation is going to catch up. When the GDP of the country goes up, what happens? More people end up getting jobs. More of national income which is generated. More of purchasing power in the hands of the people. More of demand for goods. More of inflation. That's a logical sequence that more of GDP brings in when actually the GDP grows. But if the opposite thing were to happen, the banks don't lend, the economic growth stutters, it comes to a near recession, what do the banks do? The banks have to lower the interest rates. And the banks started lowering the interest rates in US after the central bank started taking the rates down and down and down. But there is a numerical kind of a level at which the interest rate cannot be, you realize that the interest rates cannot be lowered any further at all. What is the level? 0. US interest rates, US Central Bank Fed Reserve took the interest rates down to 0 level and the boundary was reached. At that stage, the central bankers were clueless as to what they are going to do. The interest rates were 0. The monetary policy as an instrument had been blunted. Nowhere they cannot go any further at all. Somebody came up with a bright idea. Why don't you take the money in the helicopters and drop it around the country? How I wish it were to happen in India. I don't need to go to my office at all. I'll pick up the money from the helicopter, drop money, and then go home. Precisely that is what US did. They didn't do it by way of a helicopter money. What they did was, it was known by, we don't have a board here, right? Okay, fine. It is known by a name, acronym, QE. You would have all heard of QE. Quantitative easing. What does quantitative easing mean? The central bank goes into the market, buys the securities from the market, buys the bonds from the market, injects money into the system. It not only buys very safe bonds which are issued by the US government, It buys bonds which could be categorized as near junk. Those bonds are bought by the central bank. They inject money into the system. What is the objective? You inject as much money as possible into the system, and then when you put so much money in the hands of the people, they have nothing else to do but to run into the mall and buy goods whether they need it or not. This was expectation. And how much US did of this? Just to give a quantitative expression to this, the US Fed Reserve balance sheet, not getting into the jargon again, the US Fed Reserve balance sheet had a size of $900 billion when it was in 2008. By that time, they had finished this quantitative easing, which means they started buying the bonds in the market and started pushing money into the system. Their balance sheet size had grown to a level of $4.7 trillion. It was a 5 times growth. In a matter of just about 3 to 4 years, they touched 5 times growth. I mean, a corporate sector, a corporate would have gloated about this growth. A central bank will feel ashamed if the balance sheet is going to grow. If the balance sheet is going to grow at such a breakneck speed, from a level of $900 billion, it moves to about $5,000 billion, $5 trillion, it moves up. The central bank has injected so much of money into the system. What would happen if this were to happen in India? What would be the natural consequence if we put so much of money in the hands of the people of India? Inflation. But then what happened in US? Did inflation catch on in US? No, not at all. The inflation was just marginally creeping up. It was not zooming at all. If you put, say, about 10,000 crores of extra money into the hands of the people in India, inflation would go up by at least about 10 to 20 basis points. Whereas they expanded their balance sheet 5 times and the inflation would not go up at all. Today, after having done a quantitative easing of the order of 5 times, expanding the balance sheet 5 times, they have finally found that the US economic growth is picking up, and today, if you go by the latest numbers, the US economy is growing by almost about 2.5%. But is it a big thing? I mean, India is growing at 7.9%. Is it a big thing at all? But if you compare the US economic base today with the Indian economy's base, US economy has a base of 20 trillion of goods and services being produced every year. Indian economy produces exactly 1/10 of that, about 2 trillion worth of goods and services. On a base of 20 trillion, they have started growing by 2.2% today, which is a fantastic achievement considering the fact that they were getting into a recession, they were getting into a negative growth spiral till some time back, and today they have got onto a positive growth spiral. So they are now busy unwinding the policy that they actually unfolded some time back. So what they did was quantitative easing. Now that quantitative easing, the money is being taken back. The amount of money that they have injected into the system, roughly about $4 trillion, they are busy taking back the money. Should India be concerned about it? When US central bank is taking back the money, should India be concerned about it? Yes, for very obvious reasons. What is the most obvious reason? the foreign institutional investors who come into the country in droves, to countries like India, which has a huge amount of growth potential, the US Central Bank is taking back the money, which means the FIIs have to take the money back from India, go back to US. So we will see, as the quantitative easing is getting wound up, when people are winding up the quantitative easing in US, you will find a lot of outflows from emerging market economies like India, and the amount of money that came into India in the last about 5 years, we can actually see a fraction of the money getting out. We shouldn't be surprised about it at all. But then India is a capital scarce economy. India doesn't get that much capital at all. If the inflows dwindle, that itself is a shock for the country. If the inflows dwindle and it turns into outflows, it's going to be a double whammy for the country like India, where the capital is actually getting shrunk and our investment activity is going to come to a standstill. Our economic activity is going to dwindle. Employment is going to get crippled. So this is a kind of a doomsday scenario that's getting painted by the US economy actually unwinding the quantitative easing. Now this is one part of the story. Now I am going to come to the second part of the story, which is a part of the global development. You all heard about the European debt crisis, which afflicted the world about 3 years back. Greece was in the picture at that point of time. Not because of Athens, not because of Acropolis, but because of unemployment. 50% unemployment in Greece. Youth unemployment, 50%. And the Greece economy was actually dwindling, was shrinking. And the Greece debt was mounting to an extent that when you try to measure a country's debt, one simple parameter that is employed is the debt as a percentage of GDP of the country, the debt to GDP ratio. The debt to GDP ratio of Greece went up to a level of 180%. You know what is the debt to GDP ratio of India today? Any guesses? Is India able to match up to Greece? Thankfully, we are not matching up to Greece. Thankfully. Our debt to GDP ratio today is 65%, which is pretty healthy by the international standards. So the sovereign debt crisis, when it broke out, Greece became the first casualty that it was not able to pay back the government bonds that the Greece government had issued. If the government issues a bond, you expect the government to pay back. If the corporate issues a bond, that could be a corporate default. The corporate would maybe fold up tomorrow, so the bond money is not paid back at all. But the government should not have that problem at all. The government should be able to manufacture the money from the central bank and pay it back to the depositor. For the first time, Greece was not able to pay back, and running closely behind Greece were actually much bigger economies in Europe. Greece was much smaller. You had Portugal running behind Greece, Spain, Italy, Netherlands. All these economies were racing ahead of each other to default on the government obligations. This was an ominous signal for the European economy that the entire sovereign debt in Europe is falling into tatters, is falling into default, and people would not like to invest in Europe at all. This was a sovereign debt crisis period which sent flutters across the world, and the exchange rates, the foreign exchange rates across the world started collapsing. This is the second part of the story. We come to the third part of the story, which originates in China. China is the second largest economy in the world, producing $12 trillion of goods and services, next only to US. The Chinese economy started slowing down. Why? Why is the Chinese economy slowing down today? Why is it grinding down from a GDP growth of close to about 11%? Today, China is recording a GDP growth of 6.5 to 6%. Why is it grinding down? Simple reason is China has built up so much of infrastructure across the country that today it has built the infrastructure up to the total capacity, much more than the capacity, much more than the demand, that today practically the domestic demand in China has already died down. So that is actually bringing in a huge amount of slowdown in the Chinese economy. Added to this is the problem of the US economy not growing sufficiently fast enough. The European economy is actually all crashing down. This is actually the external demand which China was catering to. China was catering to a lot of electronic items. China was catering to a lot more fundamental basic items which across the world needed. I mean, even in India, if you want a toy of Ganesha or you want a toy of, I think, even Hanuman, you will get it from China. That was a kind of a Chinese market which they had developed to produce, to cater to the every corner of the world. When the external sector started dying, when the external sector started slowing down, and the domestic sector, they had already built up excess capacity, the Chinese economy started slowing down. It came down grinding to a halt of 6.5%. But then add to this the other overlay of what was happening in the Chinese financial market. Any idea what happened in the Chinese stock markets last year? The Chinese stock markets had appreciated by 150% in the year 2015. It came crashing down in June of 2015 by almost about 90%. A good part of the gains that they had recorded in 2015, it took just about 10 to 15 trading sessions in June for that entire crash to happen. The stock market started crashing. In December, there was another crash. Add to it what the Chinese authorities did. The Chinese authorities, in the matter of exchange rate, they were as confused as anybody else. They didn't know what to do as far as the exchange rate is concerned. In the month of August, one fine morning, when I entered the dealing room of the Reserve Bank of India, I work with the dealing room of the Reserve Bank of India. I entered the dealing room of the Reserve Bank of India, and I saw an announcement running in the screen. Chinese authorities have devalued the currency by 3.1%. Shocker to the entire financial markets. Chinese currency has been devalued by 3.1%. When a currency moves by about 0.1, 0.2% on a day, it makes news in the foreign exchange markets. On a single day, overnight, they devalued the currency by 3.1%. It was a shocker across the financial markets. The Indian stock markets crashed. The Indian currency crashed on that day. I'm talking about August 11th of 2015. To assuage, to calm the jitters which were taking place across the financial market, the Chinese authorities came out with a statement the same evening, August 11th. They came and told the entire world, this is a one-time devaluation that we are doing. We will never do it in our lives again. But this is a bitter medicine that you need to take. If China has to grow, we have to devalue the currency. Now, this is something which many of us have a myth about. When Narendra Modi came to power in May 2014, people are talking about our currency being strong, powerful currency. Is a powerful currency good for the country? Powerful currency is utterly bad for the country. Unfortunately, our politicians don't realize that. They say BJP is strong, so rupee is strong. So we need a very strong rupee. We had to tell the ruling party from the central bank, we cannot have a currency which can be strong forever. If the Indian rupee were to be strong forever, Indian exports would crumble. Indian exports would crash. We will never be able to compete in any of the international export markets at all. So if we need the export markets on a regular basis, the most important thing that has to happen to our exchange rate is that the rupee has to depreciate. Rupee perhaps has to depreciate in an orderly manner. It cannot crash land. It has to depreciate in an orderly manner. Similarly, what China did was a kind of a shock treatment to their currency. They brought down their currency by 3.1% on a single day, shocked the markets, and gave an assurance to the market that we are not going to devalue the currency anytime more. This is only a one-time shocker. Market went back home happily, resting assured. China has assured us that they are not going to devalue the currency. Next morning, when all the dealers enter the dealing room of all the countries, all the banks, they find another ticker running. China has devalued the currency for the second time in 24 hours by another 2%. 5% devaluation in a matter of 24 hours, coming after an assurance that we are not going to devalue the currency at all. The whole world lost faith in the Chinese currency. The whole world lost faith in the Chinese policy makers. And they thought that the Chinese authorities didn't know what they were doing at all. That day we saw a huge amount of crash in the Indian markets. I'm talking about August 12th. We saw another big crash in the Indian markets, big crash in the Indian currency. Now, all this I'm trailing only because when you're talking about managing financial markets sitting in a central bank, the most important thing that you need to follow, apart from understanding the financial market, of course, you have to have an idea of the quantitatives out there. You have to have an idea of the statistics. You have to have the idea of mathematics. You have to understand the mechanics of market working. But more than all this, the most important thing that the central banker has to have is excellent communication. If he does not communicate with clarity, the entire financial market gets confused, and the death knell for the financial market is lack of clarity and uncertainty. This is exactly what happened when on August 11th and August 12th, China devalued the currency, and then the financial markets went into a tizzy. Now, over and above this, look what happened in China. China, because it had grown at a real hectic pace, its demand for commodities, China was a guzzler of commodities. China was a guzzler of petrol. China was a guzzler of diesel. All this demand started dying down, and you could see the oil prices crashing down. So this is one part of the story, which means China slowing down, how it impacts the entire world, how it impacts emerging market economies like India. Now come to the last episode, which happened on June 23rd, just about 2 weeks back. What is that? Brexit. Look at exactly what are the mechanics which are driving the Brexit. I'm talking purely from a financial market perspective. I'm not looking into the political part of the Brexit at all. On June 23rd, the Brexit referendum took place in UK. Till June 22nd, when the exit polls were taken, clear indications were that UK would remain a part of EU and it would not split out of EU at all. Morning of 23rd, as the elections start, as the voting starts, in Britain, and again the last set of exit polls actually started polling with the voters, a completely different trend emerged. Completely different trend. All the while, we thought that the Leave camp would get defeated, the Remain camp would win. And on the exit poll day, on the referendum day, when the last exit polls were done, every time the exit poll results were announced, you could find a gap of at least 3 to 4% between Leave and Remain camp. Leave camp all the time leading by 3 to 3.5%. By about Indian time, close to about midnight, it was fairly clear that Britain is going to leave the EU. But does this end the story? Actually, it does not end the story. It actually starts the story there. The story of uncertainty starts from there. What is the story of uncertainty from Brexit? Number one, when Britain leaves the EU, EU is a conglomerate of 28 nations, big and small. Big nations like UK, big nations like Germany, Netherlands, Italy, Spain. Small nations also included there. When a big nation like UK exits this, people ask the question, is there an economic logic for these people to exit? Look at very carefully, is there an economic logic? I don't know how many of you have been going through the financial newspapers. If any newspaper has been able to give one single article giving a strong economic logic for Britain to quit EU, I would be surprised. The strand of logic which has run through the entire Brexit is one of politics, and more severely, it concerns immigration. A good number of Syrians started running away from their country simply because of the misrule in their country. And all these people started taking refuge in EU because EU's refugee laws are pretty lax. They allow a lot of foreigners to come into the country, take political asylum, settle down in the country. The first of these countries which adopted a very liberal, open, welcome attitude, Germany, led by Angela Merkel. Angela, actually she became an angel for the refugees. Angela said, she said, I'm going to welcome all the refugees. After all, it's a humanitarian gesture. When these people swim aside the sea and come into the German shores, we can't tell them go back. Now this created a huge amount, it's opened up a Pandora's box in the entire EU. People are wondering, are we going to allow refugees coming in droves, coming in millions? What is going to happen to our economy? Now once they enter EU, because Britain was a part of EU, they can actually walk into UK without a visa. Because having entered EU, they can enter UK without much of a problem at all. Now this became a big political issue in UK. Lot of such immigrants, particularly from Syria, they started taking away the jobs of the people in Britain. They started creating a huge amount of infrastructure difficulty in UK, and the UK population started actually having a sense of revulsion towards them. Along with the immigrants, unfortunately, some terrorist incidents which took place in Paris, in Brussels, this added to more revulsion against the immigrants, thinking that the immigrants are the people who are bringing in terror into EU, into UK. In fact, at that point of time in Heathrow also there was an incident which took place. So Heathrow incident, Paris, Brussels, all this actually painted an absolute black picture of the immigrants. This issue was taken up by the Conservative Party, one section of the Conservative Party, which said that Britain should part with EU. The moment this vote came, basically because of the threat of the immigrants, the financial markets are completely surprised. The financial markets are just not amused at all. If you looked at what happened to pound sterling after that, pound sterling has slipped by more than 15% from the time when the Brexit vote came up till yesterday night, when it touched 1.27 from a level of close to about 1.49. And it has now touched its low in a matter of almost about 30 years. Why is that happening to pound sterling? The first thing is, when Britain breaks out of EU, if you analyze the vote in EU, the Brexit vote, all the young people in Britain have voted to remain. All the old people in Britain have voted to leave. Imagine a complete contradiction, a complete paradox. The old people who are going to leave this world in 10 years and 15 years, they have voted to actually leave. The young people who are going to remain in Britain for the next 50 years, 60 years, they have voted to remain, and Britain is going to exit. And with this exit, the amount of investments that was flowing into Britain and London particularly is going to stop, because London was acting as a gateway to the European community. I mean, people want to set up shops in Europe. They wouldn't go to any European country at all. They would go and open a shop in London. And from that shop in London, from that factory in London, from that company in London, they could export to any of the countries, 27 countries in Europe, without any restriction, without any tariffs, without any barriers. Today, that gate is getting closed. So all investments which are likely to flow into Britain to set up manufacturing facilities, to set up servicing facilities, all that is going to stop. Number two, the trade with Europe. Today, UK exports 54% of its entire exports go to EU, 27 countries. If this gate is going to get closed, 54% of their exports are going to take a nosedive. Entire exports of UK in the balance sheet of UK, BOP account, it's the asset side, the export side is going to come down. There are some people who argue that Britain will be able to find alternative markets. It's not a problem at all. Just not possible at all. For 27 of these countries to find alternative markets, even if you want to enter into a treaty with each and every country there, each treaty would take at least about 2 to 3 years to sign. It's not a simple thing. So if Britain is going to be alive for the next about 15 years remaining outside EU, perhaps they can hopefully strike treaties with these 27 nations. Now already you find sense of a complete confusion in Britain that people who voted to actually leave EU, today they are regretting. Now there is a talk of second referendum. There is a talk that people are coming onto the streets. There is a talk that there is a widespread protest in London that the entire voting did not reflect the minds of the British at all. The point that I am trying to drive home here is that the financial markets across the world hate one thing, that is uncertainty. And what has come out of Brexit today is total uncertainty. We don't know whether Britain is going to leave. We don't know if it has decided to leave, when is it going to leave? And when it decides to leave, and when it actually leaves, what are going to be the aftermath? What is going to be the consequences? Nobody is aware of this. This kind of an uncertainty is taking the pound sterling down. This is taking the euro down. In the process, what has happened is the dollar is going up. Why? The dollar is a base currency. Against the base currency pound sterling is quoted. Against the base currency euro is quoted. So all of the currencies are going down, the dollar is going up. Great for US, the dollar is going up. Maybe if Narendra Modi were to be the Prime Minister of US. But then just imagine, the US growth is just picking up. It has touched barely 2.2%. And if the dollar starts appreciating, only God can save the US. Again, the US growth is going to turn down. It's going to be another point of inflection. It's going to come down. For the emerging market economies like India, this is going to be a big problem because if US grows, we grow. If US falters, we falter. A good part of our exports today, about 35% of our exports today is to US. If US is going to falter, if US growth is not going to pick up, our entire exports will not be able to see a turnaround at all. You are aware that in the last 18 months, the Indian exports are tumbling, and the Indian exports have come down from a level of close to about $300 billion about 2 years back. It is now hitting almost about $240 billion. $60 billion, the Indian exports have already come down. So this is where, when you talk about the markets, how it bites, I'm talking about how our export market has been bitten and how our foreign exchange market is reflecting that bite. Now, this is the story of the world that I wanted to describe in the first part as to what has been happening as a part of the global development. That means the US slowdown, the US monetary policy action, QE, US now trying to exit the monetary policy QE, sovereign debt crisis happening, Greece actually getting into a tizzy, oil prices crashing, and finally, Brexit happening. In the midst of all this, now let's look at what is happening in India. If you look at India in the midst of all this, India was not affected to that extent by the global financial crisis. The Indian growth did go down, did not plunge. We went down to a level of close to about 5.3%, not bad for a big country like India, which has a GDP base of almost about $2 trillion. But nevertheless, as a central bank, as a government, we are concerned about it because if India is not growing up to its capacity, what is the capacity? Capacity could be almost about 10 to 11%. If we are not going to grow up to the capacity, there is a huge amount of output gap between the capacity at which we grow and the actual level at which we grow. The gap is going to be of the order of close to about 3 to 4%. The most important thing that is going to happen is we will never be able to come out of the poverty levels. We will never be able to improve our national income. We will never be able to improve the per capita income. So all these are going to have a telling impact on the overall employment situation in the country. This is where our concerns stem from. This is where our entire policy making is going to take a cue that we need to keep the growth at a higher level. Now, from a 5.3% growth after the global financial crisis, the most important objective of the government and the Reserve Bank has been to prop up growth. But typically, in a country like India, if we grow very fast, the most important thing that happens is inflation. So we have to balance between growth and inflation. As growth picks up, the inflation also picks up. As growth comes down, the inflation also comes down. Generally, the two move in tandem. Now, this is a bane for a central bank which is targeting that the growth of the economy should pick up. While the growth picks up, the inflation also picks up. So, to pick up growth, to accelerate growth, the central bank lowers the interest rate. When it lowers the interest rate, the borrowing cost in the economy goes up, no doubt about it at all. But at the same time, the demand in the economy picks up because you and I will be able to borrow very heavily from the bank. You and I will be able to spend very heavily in the malls. And we will be able to create a huge amount of demand in the system. And this demand, when it is not met by capacity production requirement, it results in excess demand outstripping the capacity and the inflation creeps in. So this is where the policy dilemma for RBI lies. When you take the interest rate down, take it down very slowly. Don't crash land the interest rate. If you are going to crash land the interest rate, growth may pick up, but simultaneously inflation would also pick up. And if you look at what is the most important objective for a central bank, the Indian central bank follows in the footsteps of the Deutsche Bundesbank, which is a German central bank. The Deutsche Bundesbank has a prime objective of curbing inflation. Why were they actually obsessed with inflation? This is simply because of the fact that after the Second World War, not after the Second World War, in the 1930s, when the inflation came in a big way in Germany, the central bank had to take lorries and vans and trucks to mop up the money from the system. So much of money was floating around in the system that unless they mopped up the entire money, the inflation would not subside at all. And any financial crisis, if it is allowed to blow up, it's going to be a recipe for a social turmoil. The first thing that happens in any country is, if the inflation goes beyond a particular level, there could be anarchy in the country, there could be turmoil in the country, the entire social fabric of the country breaks down. That's where the finance and the social fabric gets completely intertwined. And that's why the central bank and the central government of a country have to work in close coordination to ensure that while the growth picks up in the country, actually the inflation remains at a reasonable level. Now today, if you look at what has happened to India after the global financial crisis, after particularly Dr. Raghuram Rajan when he took over, I'm talking more from the angle of September 2013, the interest rates started moving up slowly. The interest rates went up to a level of 8%. What do we call the interest rate indicator as? Repo rate. The repo rate went up to 8%. From 8.8%, now we have brought it down to by 150 basis points in the last about 1.5 years, basically to prop up the growth. While we are doing this, while the growth is picking up in the economy, while we see according to the latest GDP numbers, India is growing at 7.9%. Mind you, 7.9%, no major economy is growing today in the world. When I attend the G20 meetings in China, when we say that India is growing at 7.9%, people look at us with a sense of awe, sense of envy, sense of jealousy. How India is able to grow at this rate, 7.9% on a base of 2 trillion GDP. But along with it, when you look at inflation, inflation after touching a high of almost about 11.7% had come down to a low of almost about 4%. But then again it is rearing its head again. It has now touched about 5.6%. This is where RBI's concern arises from. While we are taking the interest rates down, while the clamor of the industry around India is to push the interest rates down and down, the central bank is concerned about the fact that if we are going to take it faster, take it down faster, inflation would also go up and it would completely offset the good job done on the monetary policy front so far. This is what RBI is going to be concerned all the time. Now this is where our interest rate policy, while it is coming as a butt of criticism today, and perhaps Dr. Raghuram Rajan decided to go out basically because of a difference of opinion on the interest rate policy, that RBI is holding tight on the interest rate policy. But you can very well understand, if we had taken down the interest rates much faster, the inflation in the country would have gone back to the 10%, 11% level, with the result that the currency would have depreciated very heavily. Now come to the second scenario, which is the last scenario that I am going to talk for about 5 minutes on the Indian currency. In 2013, when US was downgraded below the investment notch, a huge amount of outflows took place from India. In a matter of 3 months, August, September, October of 2013, $13 billion of money flew out of the country. All the FII investments in debt, it flew out. A small part of the FII investments in equity also flew out. And the resulting impact on the exchange rate was calamitous. The impact on the exchange rate was terrible. The exchange rate in India collapsed from a level of 55 to a dollar to 68.85 to a dollar. In a matter of just about 1 year, it collapsed by more than about 20%. Now, this was such a huge, precipitous fall. There are questions which are asked of RBI, why didn't you intervene in the market? You say, Reserve Bank says, we are against volatility in the market. Why don't you intervene in the market? Now, for your information, we were not sleeping at that time. We were intervening in the market. We sold not $1 or $2, we sold $55 billion in the market. $55 billion. Our foreign exchange reserves came down by more than about $60 billion at that point of time. And there are other sets of people who come and ask, RBI should have sold more. Why did it stop with $55 billion? While one set of people say RBI did not intervene sufficiently, another set of people come and say RBI should have sold at least about $100 billion. What are you going to do with the foreign exchange reserves? The foreign exchange reserves are meant for, as they are all called as rainy day reserves. If they are rainy day reserves, the Reserve Bank should have used these reserves, intervened in the market, calmed the jitters in the currency market, and brought about an orderliness in the market. Let me tell you, both the criticisms are valid from some perspective, not from all perspectives. While the rupee should have depreciated to ensure that the currency gets a better export competitiveness, if the currency had depreciated to 70 or 75 levels, the most important impact would have been the amount of oil that we import from Gulf, which costs us approximately $160 billion every year. Even at the reduced prices of oil, we still import oil worth $125 billion a year. If the dollar were to rise and rupee were to fall by another 20%, this bill of 120% would have straight away jumped to $150 billion. And our entire balance of payments and our entire current account would have gone out of shape. In 2013, our current account deficit, what is current account? Current account is a simple difference between the total amount of exports minus the imports plus the invisibles. The tourism earnings, the invisible software earnings, if you put all this together, you get a simple balance sheet called the current account. This current account, India has been always running in a deficit. Our exports are always less than imports. So when we get into this kind of a current account deficit, who finances this current account deficit? We are after all consuming more than what we earn. Who finances it? These are finances by foreign investors who walk into the country, the foreign institutional investors who come into the country, the foreign direct investors who come into the country, the non-resident depositors who come into the country, the Reliances and L&Ts which go outside the country and borrow by way of external commercial borrowing. these monies actually finance the current account deficit of the country. If the current account deficit in a country like India blows up beyond a particular level, which is bound to happen if we allow the currency to appreciate very heavily, we will never be able to finance a current account deficit, and our currency would come under this speculative attack, which a central bank will never be able to prevent. There are countries which have come under speculative attack even in the last 10 years, which have faced a turmoil after the speculative attack. They have never been able to come out of the speculative attack for the next about 10 years. It actually puts back the country's economy by about 10 years if the currency were to come under a speculative attack. So apart from inflation, the central bank is going to be bothered about holding on the currency on a firm footing, on a stable footing, to ensure that the country's macroeconomic fundamentals are strong. I'm going to stop with this. I've taken about an hour. I'll open myself for about 15 minutes of questions. Any questions on any of the areas that I was discussing? Any questions with a hard criticism on RBI is most welcome. No problem at all. Yeah. Now, I think you can come here and ask the question for the benefit of other people and for my benefit. No, you can come to the mic so that others also listen.
A very good morning, sir. We are honored to have you here. Just now, a couple of minutes back, you were talking about 2015 currency rise that happened. The rupee was the rupee prices went up from 55 rupees per dollar to 70. It reached even 70. You said 68, but I saw a 70 figure as well. So, sir, you said that the RBI flowed in $55 billion into the market to stable the rupee rate. So, sir, you also said that had the petrol prices not been stable at that point of time, so the bill that was 120 billion would have reached 150 billion. So what would have been the RBI's matter in that point, at that point of time, had the petrol prices also risen to that level? Thank you so much.
Thank you. No, I agree with the questioner. I think it's a pretty important question. What if the petrol prices had risen at that point of time? I mean, whether we would have been able to control. I completely agree that there are externalities to any policy making. One of the important externalities in India to policy making, what is the most important externality in Indian policy making? Monsoon, which all of us are experiencing now. If the monsoon were to fail, that's the biggest externality which can affect our policy making. This year, thankfully, the monsoon is okay, so perhaps the policy is going to be on track. Similarly, oil prices. If the oil prices are going to simply climb up, zoom up, this is an externality which we need to tackle with our foreign exchange reserves. Now, today we have $363 billion of foreign exchange reserves. We are not sure that the oil price is going to be stabilized at this point. Oil prices are now hovering around 45 to 46. If they are going to stabilize around this, it's good for India, it's good for the Gulf countries. But if the oil prices are going to go up to about 70, 80, our exports are going to go, our entire oil price bill is going to go up. At that point of time, what we feel is that if the oil prices go up, the Gulf countries benefit. If the Gulf countries benefit, they start importing a lot more goods from India. So look at the oil prices is not on a single dimension. You have to look at two dimensions. While oil prices going up, the import cost of the bill for India will go up. It opens up a lot of export opportunities for India to the Gulf countries, which is pretty good. Number two, a lot of Indians are employed in the Gulf. You know, the amount of remittances that we get from all these people is close to about $70 billion. If the oil prices go up, our remittances route would actually get bulged up, and we will be able to finance a current account deficit through that route. So oil prices going up, I would not call it as an unmitigated disaster. But if it goes up all the way to say about $100 or $115, it is going to be a disaster. Good question.
Good morning, sir. Sir, you mentioned that India is growing at the rate of 7.9%, but
No, I'm finding it very difficult to hear. There's a lot of echo in this room. I don't know, somebody has to come. Can you come here and speak so that I find it a little easier? Too much of echo. Yeah, India is growing at 7.9%.
sir, India is growing at 7.9%, but if we look at the past records, since the last 18 months, the IIP is continuously declining. So the exports are collapsing of India. So how it is growing? Is it a myth that about the 7.9%, which most of the countries are questioning today?
I'm very happy about this question that somebody is watching the IIP very carefully. I'm extremely happy that you have a very discerning person in the audience watching the IIP. In fact, this has been the question which has been racking the minds of the central bank. What is IIP? Index of Industrial Production. If you look at the Index of Industrial Production, we have even touched a nadir of negative at some point of time, and we have been actually fluctuating around zero for the last almost about 18 months. But rightly, as he asked the question, while you take the GDP has been growing at an average of about 7 to 7.5% in the last about 1 year. How is this dichotomy happening at all? Now, when you look at GDP, only one sector of GDP is manufacturing. IIP is seeking to look at only the manufacturing part of it. It doesn't look at the other things like agriculture, services, any other aspect, mining, all that doesn't come under at all. This is only the industry part of it, the manufacturing part of it. That is number one. Number two, IIP is a volume indicator. It's not a price indicator. So when you talk about a volume indicator, what happens is, if I produce, say, about 10 tons of steel last year, and I produce only 11 tons of steel this year, the growth in IIP is 10%. But if the price of steel has fallen in the meantime, my GDP actually will be reflected poorly actually. So the price measurement is not taken into account in IIP, so it becomes only a volume indicator. So being only a volume indicator, there is bound to be a dichotomy between the volume indicator and the price volume indicator, which is a GDP. That dichotomy could arise out of the prices and the inflation. Good question again. Yeah. I think, why don't you come here?
Just hold it at the same distance. Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
Sir, the government is projecting a GDP of $5 trillion of Indian currency or the Indian GDP in next few years. Probably targeting the next 2019 Lok Sabha election or whatever parliamentary election.
No, sorry, I'm still not able to get. Can you come closer? That echo is creating a lot of problem for me. No, you can use the mic for the benefit of others. At least the echo gets muzzled when you come closer actually.
So the government is projecting a GDP of $5 trillion in next few years. So what you said is the country is growing, the inflations are also going to grow up. So it basically means our foreign reserve, we have to go up from 370 billions into a much higher range. What RBI policies are thinking to curb these inflations? Because inflation is already high in our country as of now.
Yeah, right. The question asked is, we are targeting India to be a 5 trillion economy in some years from now. Today, India is only a 2 trillion economy, which means 2.5 times it is going to grow in the matter of next about, say, 10 years or so. Now, if it is going to grow at that kind of a feverish speed, will not inflation catch up? Number one. Number two, do we need to not build up sufficient amount of foreign exchange reserves? I agree. I completely agree. In the sense that if India is going to grow, all the other macro indicators have also to grow side by side. So when you talk about inflation, inflation is something which should not grow side by side. If India is going to grow to reach about 5 trillion economy, this growth cannot be achieved overnight at all. If you think that India's capacity for growth today is roughly about 10%, then 10% if it is going to grow for the next about 10 years, which means India can actually virtually more than double its growth. It can touch about $5 trillion in a matter of about 10 years. But while it grows at 10%, while we create that capacity, how do we create that capacity? We create that capacity by having investment all around. What is the most important investment to be done in India? Infrastructure. We don't have good roads, we don't have good dams, we don't have good airports. So these infrastructures have to be created. Now these infrastructures, when they are created, they will pave the way for sufficient amount of demand to be created in the system, matched with the capacity which has been created. So that will keep the growth alive, and that will also keep inflation under a lid. Now let's assume we create a capacity much in excess of the demand. What is happening in China? Inflation would crash. If we are going to create a capacity which is much lower than the demand, inflation would rear its head. So you have to balance it very carefully. This is where RBI's monetary policy is all about. We are going to do trade-off all the time while we are focusing on India's growth. We don't want growth to go to a level where it exceeds the output capacity. It creates a huge amount of demand which cannot be met. At the same time, it cannot be so slow that the demand is there which is not met sufficiently by the capacity. So this is where we are going to do a trade-off between growth and inflation. This would involve operating the monetary policy in a very optimal manner, taking the interest rates up and taking the interest rates down, injecting sufficient amount of liquidity, absorbing that much of liquidity which is unwarranted in the system. This is more an art, less a science. Although economics says that it is a science, I am not a person who believes that economics is a science at all. Economics is much more an art. Economics is much less a science. We can take several anecdotal evidences and say that for a country like India, this is an optimal growth rate. But then things are changing so dynamically every moment that it's difficult to say that that particular optimal growth rate, what you say today, is prevalent next year also. So the central bank has to be on its feet all the time. It has to see the incoming data all the time. It has to read the data. It has to make proper interpretation of the data, and the policy formulation has to take a cue from this data.
Please come in the front.
I just want to ask, first, good morning. I want to ask you, why was CSO or central government, BJP government, when they came into power in 2014, they changed the GDP base year from earlier 2004-5 to 2011-12. Was it only because to show the growth rate higher than the previous government, or there is some other logic also behind this?
Very political question actually, but anyway, I'll reply to that. I think this question is also burdened on the same lines that IIP and this. A lot of controversy has come up in the country after the statistical numbers were revised about 1.5 years back by the Central Statistical Organization. The revision is not done from the angle of, it's not Narendra Modi directed revision. It's a revision which has been self-driven by the Central Statistical Organization, not being directed by the BJP government at the center at all. When they did this revision, the first objective of this revision was to bring the entire GDP measurement in the country in alignment with the international best practices which has been spelled out by the IMF. So this alignment has now been achieved, and our entire way of measuring GDP In fact, we no longer call it as GDP. Our indicator is GVA, gross value added. It's not gross domestic product. Gross value added is a kind of an international measurement index for the country's growth rate. Now, what has happened here is, when you take the base period upward, you bring it closer. This is a very, very normal phenomenon which happens with any index. We had a 2004-5 base. That base had become a little obsolete. We had to make it a little more recent. We had to bring it to a closer period, which was a normal period. The 2012-13 period was considered as a normal period, so the base was upgraded to a recent period to measure our growth better. And apart from that, lot more technicalities have been loaded into it exactly to bring it in line with the international practices. So what has been done by the Central Statistical Organization is not a kind of a jugglery or an exercise to paint the country in a better picture. Basically, it's an exercise to update the entire GDP, manner of calculation of GDP, and that's what has been done. When any time a macro index undergoes a change, there will always be problems of some ups and downs, there will always be criticisms. We are going through that period. I'm sure that this would stabilize in a matter of just about 1 year. Even within RBI, we have had a lot of dialogue with the Central Statistical Organization. And I can say that I have not completely understood the way that they have revised. But the fact that I have not understood does not mean that what they have done is wrong. I will only say the fact that I have not understood is a part of my ignorance, not a part of criticism of the Central Statistical Organization.
So, very good morning. So, my question is related to the recent happening of the Kingfisher case. Like, in today's world, in India, there are 10 corporate houses that are defaulted of 7 lakh crore rupees. So, what are the steps that banks are taking towards them? Because when a normal citizen defaults a loan, there are heavy penalties.
Just repeat it again.
Sir, in India today, 10 corporate houses are owing 7 lakh crores to the PSUs. So they are willful defaulters or probably defaulters. So what steps are RBI taking towards strengthening the norms so that they don't will default in future? Because when a normal citizen defaults, there are heavy penalties and strict things are taking towards them.
Right. Again, a good question, difficult to answer. He is asking the question, why the public sector banks, when they have about 7 lakh crores of defaulting loans from big borrowers, what is the Reserve Bank doing about it? I mean, it's one of the important criticisms of RBI that Reserve Bank has been sleeping over these bad loans. Now, it is also traditionally said, he was asking the question where small borrowers are pulled up, the big borrowers are not pulled up at all. Now, it's always said in banking, when a small borrower borrows, it's the borrower's problem. When a big borrower borrows, it's a bank's problem. So what happens is, typically when a big borrower is not going to repay, the bank's balance sheet is going to come under a severe attack. If you look at the norms that we have spelled out, we have not relaxed any of these norms. All that we are trying to do as a part of the asset quality review is to enforce these norms even more strictly. Now, there has been some restructuring done of some of these loans in the aftermath of the global financial crisis. In the aftermath of the global financial crisis, many of the firms, their exports, their local demand, all that dried up. So we had to give them a little more leeway to actually get out of this crisis and survive. We did that. We gave them about a 3-year period at that time. The 3-year period is almost coming to a close. The question that is now being asked is, should we not restructure the loans further? If we restructure the loans any further, then it is going to get into a complete non-performing category, keeping the entire balance sheets absolutely opaque. So what Dr. Raghuram Rajan says is, now that we have given sufficient amount of leeway, bring it out in the open. Let us accept the fact that we have bad loans on our balance sheet, provide for the bad loans, clean up the balance sheet, and go about your normal business of lending. This is what he is saying. Now, as far as bringing these defaulters to book is concerned, banks are taking sufficient number of measures. But unfortunately, the legal system in India is one where actually it takes a pretty long time to get a case through. I'm sure all of you will reach your old age before Vijay Mallya is punished. I'm sure about, because I have so much faith in the Indian legal system. That's how the Indian legal system works. So what we are now thinking about is entire resolution regime for the banking system, resolution regime for the corporates. If the resolution regime were to be in place, where there is a good law which can actually speed up all these actually recoveries, I'm sure the banking system would be able to function much more efficiently, and that's what we are targeting. Yeah.
Sir, I could not understand your point that if the rupee appreciates, if like rupees right now is trading at around $67.7, so if it appreciates, if it comes down to 60 or 55 even, will it be good for Indian economy or will it not be good for Indian economy?
Will it be good, you're saying?
Because I could not understand the point that you made that if the rupee appreciates, if the value of rupee appreciates, will it be good for Indian economy, for Indian exports or not?
No, you can't make a very objective statement like that. When you talk about rupee appreciation and rupee depreciation, India is a massive economy. India is a diversified economy. India imports, India exports. India imports every year $480 billion of goods. India exports every year close to about $260 billion of goods. The trade deficit between exports and imports, if you take it, comes to almost about $220 billion. As and when the rupee appreciates, it benefits our importers. They are able to import at a cheaper rate. As and when the rupee depreciates, it benefits our exporters. So the question arises now, should central bank practice a policy which has a constant slant towards exporters, avoiding the importers, or should have a constant slant towards importers, avoiding the exporters? No, it cannot be done at all. It's going to be a middle of the road policy where we go by what is the equilibrium exchange rate dictated by the model. There is a real effective exchange rate model which gives us some fundamental idea of where the equilibrium exchange rate is. We go according to the model. If the rupee is going to unidirectionally depreciate all the time, the importers are going to pay through their nose. Inflation would go up. It would again ruin. So obviously, nothing is going to be a free lunch for us. If we are on oil, for example, all Gulf countries today, if there the oil prices go up, they enjoy. The oil prices come down, they suffer. For them, it's absolutely clear direction is spelled out. Whereas India, being a diverse economy, the direction is actually, it is bi-directional.
Hello, sir. I have a question for you. Firstly, government has announced 7 pay commissions will be implemented from this year itself. And RBI has set a target of inflation at 5% by 2017 January.
No, sorry. Repeat again. I'm still not clear. Hold the mic a little lower.
Yeah.
Lower. Yeah.
Government of India has implemented the 7th pay commission guidelines, and RBI has set a inflation target of 5% by January 2017. And it is estimated that close to 1 lakh crore will be added to the government employees. So do you think that this will actually add inflationary pressures to current Indian scenario? And will RBI revise the target taking this as a parameter? Because if central government employees are getting a hike, even the state government will follow.
I would definitely say it's a good question, because when you talk about the pay commission recommendations which are implemented right now, it's going to really put a huge amount of dent on the government's balance sheet. When the pay commission recommendations are implemented, obviously the demand for goods in the economy is going to go up. Possibly the inflation would also go up. Possibly. But then whether the Reserve Bank is going to revise the inflation target, certainly not. See, this is a monetary policy framework that we have entered into with the central government after a lot of dialogue, deliberation and thought. If you are going to revise the target every year, it's going to create a huge amount of problem. Right now, the target is quite flexible. It is 4 plus or minus 2. So which means basically we can accept a 2% inflation and we can accept a 6% inflation. Generally, the Indian inflation is prone to go up rather than coming down. So there is a chance that the inflation would go up because of the pay commission recommendations. But then at the same time, we are also feeling that there is going to be a huge amount of demand for the consumer goods, consumer durables and all that the industry pickup is also going to be seen. The green shoots which we are seeing today, they could actually be seen in the form of real economic growth. So if the real economic growth, to match the real economic growth, if the country is going to build up sufficient amount of capacity, we can actually put a lid on the inflation. It may not really break out like a genie out of the bottle. We are not going to allow the inflation to go out like a genie out of the bottle for the simple reason that if we find at any point of time the capacity creation is not matching with the demand, we will take the interest rates up. So the inflation target is not going to be manipulated upon. What we are going to juggle around with is the repo rate.
So one more question. In December 2016, the FCNR-B bonds will be actually getting matured, which were issued on 30th November 2013 to infuse capital during Rajan's term. So do you think that will actually deplete your Indian foreign exchange reserves? Will RBI intervene in it? if required?
Again, a good question, because this is something which basically the people in the financial sector can understand. The others generally don't pay much of an attention to it, although a lot of pink papers are now focusing a lot of attention on this FCNRB redemption. Let's understand what this FCNRB is all about. How much more time, Ram, I can take? 5 minutes? Okay, right. The FCNRB is a kind of a deposit where the Reserve Bank accepted all the dollars and injected rupee into the system in 2013. Today, as a part of that contract, Reserve Bank is supposed to return the dollars back to the system and take the rupees back. Now, when the dollars are returned back to the banks will return the dollars back to the depositors, so the dollars will flow out to the country. When the dollars flow out of the country, I don't consider that as a calamity at all. The banks that got these rupees, banks that created rupee assets, these rupee assets are matching rupee assets in their balance sheet. It would not create a turmoil at all. But all these dollars going out simultaneously between September, October, November is going to create a small amount of ripple in the foreign exchange market, but not a turmoil in the foreign exchange market. If at all, let's assume my words are wrong, and there is a turmoil in the foreign exchange market, we have a kitty of $363 billion of foreign exchange reserves, which will definitely unleash into the market and hit the speculators in the market and ensure that the market is stable.
Good morning, sir.
Yeah.
My question's about inflation targeting that you were talking about earlier.
Question was?
My question's about the inflation targeting mechanism in place. So basically my question is, considering India was one of the first countries to implement inflation targeting in the 70s, and it was then later not focused upon much, and you reintroduced inflation targeting as a major objective in 2014 as well. What do you think will be done differently from the 70s? And do you think that RBI will have, if RBI has more autonomy than it does now, that it will be more effective?
Right. This is again a very technical question, very good question, because inflation targeting in the country has been introduced of late. This has been introduced as a part of the monetary policy agreement entered into between the Reserve Bank and the central government. This targeting ensures that it actually puts a responsibility on the RBI to maintain the inflation between 2% and 6%. But as a give and take, if we are given that responsibility, we are also given the autonomy to operate that we have a monetary policy committee. The monetary policy committee is going to ensure that the inflation is going to be held within these levels. Now, this target has been initially kept up to March 2017. Absolutely right. Ideally, I would say, as I was replying to his question, since the target band is pretty wide, it is 2% to 6%, 400 basis points wide, there is no need to change it immediately. We should be able to target the center of the band, which is 4%. And if you are close to the center of the band, we can reasonably be confident that we will not breach the lower floor or the higher ceiling, actually. So as long as that leeway is there, we are not going to change the targeting at all. But let's assume for some reason inflation falls in a big way towards 2%. We have to definitely think of different policy mechanisms. Today, if you look at Japan, Japan is doing exactly the opposite of India. Japan is targeting a level of inflation which it wants to achieve from a lower level. They are at a lower level, they are trying to target a 2% inflation. We are at a higher level, we want to achieve a lower level of inflation. So we are actually two different mirror images. If India is going to slip into a deflationary scenario, recessionary scenario, inflation would crash land. At that time, our entire policy objective would be to prop up inflation. But I don't think, at least in the next 10 years, we are going to reach that kind of a scenario. Thankfully, India is a country which has a demographic profile where young people abound, where young people's earning capacity is going to go up, where the demand which is going to be there in the economy is not going to dry up like this. So as long as the underlying demand in the system is going to be there, the inflationary pressures would also be there. So we don't need to target upwardly, we need to target only downwardly.
Good morning, sir. I had worked with a couple of two private banks, and what I realized over my career that because of the high amount of sales pressure, nowadays banks are doing a lot of unethical business. If a person is going to avail a personal loan, he's been asked that you even buy an insurance. And so I would like to have your view from a layman's point of view that what RBI is actually doing to make the norms stricter onto the service quality for the normal people.
Right. See, as far as, let us put the whole, I'm looking at it purely from a loans perspective that the banks are giving. Today, I mean, you get a lot of unsolicited telephone calls where as soon as you lift the telephone, they say, do you want a housing loan? Do you want this loan? Do you want that loan? People are splurging loans around you. If you look at the retail loan sector today, whether it is consumer loans or housing loans or any other consumption-oriented loan, we don't have that much of non-performing asset in that segment at all. Thankfully, that segment is functioning very well. In fact, one prime example of a bank thriving on the consumer loans and the housing loans today is HDFC Bank. HDFC Bank is doing pretty well because its entire retail segment is a bigger segment in the balance sheet. So Reserve Bank is not going to do anything specific to address this kind of a loan as long as the banks are going to follow the norms which are already laid down. The norms very clearly talk about what is the amount of exposure that you can take in the mortgage sector, what is the kind of rate of interest that you have to charge over and above the base rate and all that. As long as banks are going to follow that, we don't have any problems with that sector at all. Because all said and done, when you talk about a retail segment, your entire exposure is a wide-based exposure. It is not on one Vijay Mallya. It is on so many people. So not every one of us in the crowd will turn out to be a Vijay Mallya. That's the thing.
Sir, in the possible event...
Should we treat this as a last question? One more, okay.
In the possible eventuality of Donald Trump winning the elections, how do you think that would affect
Eventuality
India?
of?
Donald Trump winning the elections in the States.
Sorry, I didn't get it.
Donald Trump. The US elections.
US election?
Yes.
Okay, Trump, right.
Exactly. How do you think that would affect India?
How do I rate that?
No, how do you think it would affect India in case he wins?
Actually, that's what I would say is it is more a political thing, it's less a financial thing. I'm not sure what is going to happen to Trump. But after the Brexit vote went in favor of exit, I found on the TV, it was Trump who was the first to come and congratulate Britain on a great verdict, actually. And he said that it's a fantastic verdict Britain has given. Possibly one can infer from here that he may win the elections also. But if you go by the latest news, Hillary Clinton is leading by close to about 8 points over her rival, now Trump. Now what is going to happen is if Trump is going to come to power, already I think yesterday you saw Christine Lagarde's statement. She has been very critical of Trump's policy actually. It's going to be a closed door policy. It's not going to be an open approach that US is ever following all the time. If he is going to close the doors of US, not only to the immigrants, see US is very scared of Mexican immigrants. So they are trying to put the doors there because Mexican immigrants come by boats into US actually. They want to shut the doors on them. It's not merely shutting doors on the Mexicans, they want to shut the doors on the trade. Now if they are going to shut the doors on the trade, the entire World Trade Organization is going to get into jitters. The entire trade across the world is going to come to a grinding halt. So this is going to create a new dimensional shift into the entire trade regime. So I don't know what is ultimately going to happen because I don't venture into what happens in the political scenario. From a financial perspective, it tantamounts to closing and shrinking the financial markets, which is not going to be good for the markets. So I'm trying to make a politically safe statement to you.
Good morning, sir. My name is Priyanka Arora, and the question to you is, there's a rumor around that the 27 public sector commercial banks would be merged into...
Again, hold the mic. Yeah, that level is fine.
Yeah, the 27 public
No,
sector...
hold the mic lower.
27 public sector commercial banks will be merged into 6 banks.
Yeah.
So do you think this plan has any future? And if yes, then how will it be good for the Indian economy? If no, then what do you suggest would be a better solution to the problem?
It's a good question where actually the Reserve Bank and the central government are contemplating merger of a few smaller banks into bigger banks. Today, we have close to about 25 odd public sector banks in the country. Many of these smaller entities are not doing well at all. Some of the bigger entities are also not doing well. But many of the smaller entities are not doing well. So what we are now is being thought about is why not we actually merge these entities, create a bigger entity where actually the capital requirements could be manageable, and then these people will have the scales of operation in the international market. Certainly from that perspective it is going to be very good because today even State Bank of India with all its size, it doesn't measure up to the international banks standards in terms of size at all. So if we can merge about 5-6 banks, I mean these 20 odd banks can be merged into 5-6 banks, we will have really globally recognizable entities which can operate in the global scenario in a much better way. That is going to be a positive. But when you come to the negative part of it, number one, when you talk about these mergers have to be very, very carefully calibrated. If you are going to do a haphazard kind of a merger, I mean let us assume you merge about 4 very bad entities, all that you are going to get is a bigger entity, which is a worse entity, which is not going to be a good entity at all. So tomorrow the whole thing is going to go to dogs. So you have to be very careful about it. Second, on the staff front, we are going to create a lot of murmurs, grumbling and all that. Because the people who come from a bad bank, they get merged into a big bank, they think that the future is opened up. Actually, that future is muzzled. Because the employees of the bigger bank, the employees of the well-run bank would ensure that the smaller bank, the badly run bank, the employees would not have a future in the new bank at all. In fact, there are examples of previous mergers where, I can give you an example of Lakshmi Commercial Bank being merged with Canara Bank way back in 1990s. Every 2 years of service of a Lakshmi Commercial Bank employee was considered equivalent to 6 months or 1 year in Canara Bank. So people who had put in 30 years of service, that was considered as 15 years of service. So people lose out. So all these problems, actually, they are going to come on the boil. People have to really discuss, debate, and agree on as something which is a good optimal model. Otherwise, the model can backfire. Thank you very much for a very, very patient listening.